what I hope you get from today's talk is how we go from pollinators, thinking about pollinators as an animal, to how do we get to the biodiversity. The way we do that is actually through the plant, right? There are interactions between the pollinator and the plant are producing things, so the products of the pollination process provide food for other wildlife. And so when we go from pollinator to plant to other wildlife, this is the biodiversity that I'm talking about. And so instead of thinking about pollinator as sort of this unidimensional thing, if we think of pollination systems as that interaction, which is actually driving and supporting the diversity that we have, that's the way we need to sort of change the way we think about things and how we start to develop more effective land management strategies for biodiversity conservation. So just to give you a brief overview, I'm going to start off by talking about the relationship between pollination and biodiversity. A lot of you have heard about, I'm sure all of you in here are aware of pollinator decline, pollinator conservation. There tends to be a bias in the agricultural direction, bias in the honeybee direction, and there's a whole other side to things that we really need to pay more attention to, and we also need to get better strategies in place, and to do that we need to base it on data. So I'm going to transfer from that into giving you an example of how this evidence-based approach, or more data-driven approach, is really going to help to accelerate our pollinator conservation strategies. I'm going to use bumblebees as an example there. And then I'm going to finish off talking about the Beecology Project, if I have that much time. I think I'm going to get yanked before I get to that part. So, all right, so starting at the beginning, everybody's heard the term pollinator, and this may seem basic to some, but we're going to build up from here to biodiversity. So flowering plants, as you know, they can't run around and find a mate, so they need somebody else to do that for them. So transferring the male gametes to the female reproductive organs, or the stamens to the stigma. This process is called pollination. Some plants use the wind, some plants use water. The vast majority use animals to achieve this process. And so from the plant's perspective, how the animal is transferring that pollen matters. So some plants have evolved a wide variety of different mechanisms to increase their reproductive success, right? So if we look at this lobelia plant, if we have our bee or butterfly moving up, transferring pollen within the same plant, that's, from the plant's perspective, it's reproducing with itself. It's inbreeding. Some plants are self-incompatible. Some that you get what's called inbreeding depression. Others, they need to be outcrossed, which means ideally, from the plant's perspective, for most flowering plants, the pollen needs to be transferred to the plant of another species. And so if we look at things in the big picture, so flowering plants on the one hand, there are 300,000 approximately known species. So flowering plants make up the greatest number of species on the plant side of things, and the vast majority of those are animal pollinated. Now if we look at the animal side, you'll notice that I'm not using the term pollinator right away. So there are 200,000 known species of flower visiting animal, and it's not a coincidence that these numbers are similar, right? The two have co-evolved in a wide variety of ways. But I use the term flower visiting animal here because if I use the term pollinator, people may think that everything that's going on over here in terms of this plant community, so this is an typical alpine plant community, many different species in bloom at the same time, that any one of these pollinators could do the job over here, and that's simply false. So the reason that we have so many plant species and so many pollinator species is because they form these special relationships. There's interactions between the animal and the plant side of things. And this is giving you, typical pollinators. So we've got bumblebee as a single unit, butterflies. This is depicting different pollinators. By the way, in terms of the pollinators, only 1% are vertebrates, even though that 1% of what's shown here isn't a vertebrate. Clearly they're important for many plant species, and what I want you to start to think about now is that these plants are catering to a specific subset of these animals. And when I say subset, it's not at the level of bumblebee or bees in general. It's very much more specific than that. So if we look at pollinator species native to North America, just to give you a sense of the bees alone, we're talking about hundreds to thousands of species. We also have moth, butterfly pollinators, beetles, wasps, and flies. And we tend to think of bees, where when we hear about pollinators, bee-friendly, but there are plants that have evolved or that are matched up with butterflies. So they're butterfly pollinated plant species. Bees are not going to do the job. And so we really need to start thinking about plant species at the individual species level and our pollinators at the individual species level and how those two fit together. Because there isn't, everything on the animal side can't pollinate or act as a pollinator or an effective pollinator for everything on the plant side of things. So when we look at these two things together and we study them, it's called pollination biology, and it's obviously important. So if we look at things from the plant side, I mentioned that the pollen transfer is important. So from the plant's perspective, the ideal pollinator is one that's going to move from purple to purple. If the pollinator decides to move, or the animal decides to move from this purple to the yellow to the pink and back to the blue, there's a reproductive cost associated with that from the plant's perspective. So from the blue, if the blue is the donor, pollen donor, it's effectively wasting male gametes by giving it to this yellow flowered plant species. And this yellow flowered plant species, what happens is the female reproductive organ gets blocked by the heterospecific pollen, and it reduces its potential to get fertilized. So it's not just that you have something visiting, it's how those animals are visiting and making decisions that is going to dictate the population size and the diversity from the plant side of things. Now, on the animal side of things, all they care about is maximizing their energetic intake per unit time, right? So they don't care about plant reproduction. They'll go around and they'll sample different things, and they'll make decisions based on the quality of the nectar or pollen, depending on which type of animal you'll talk about, or which type of animal that you're focused on. So how is it then? So as I mentioned, the ideal pollinator from the plant's perspective is one that does this. And if you go out and you observe pollinators, individual pollinators are very specialized in their foraging habits at the individual level. At the species level, they can be generalized, meaning that if we have a particular bumblebee species, you may see it on every one of these different plant species, but the individuals are highly specialized. So the plant is winning this battle at first glance, and even if all of these flowers are equally rewarding, you still tend to see these biases. There's the individual specialization, and you tend to see some specialization at higher levels. Now, so how is it that the plants are manipulating their pollinators? There's this notion out there of pollination syndromes, that the plants, the flowers look the way they do, they smell the way they do because they are innately attracting these animals. And this is utterly false. So I pulled this from pollinator.org. So in terms of what are we going to plant, what do we need to put in our gardens or on our landscapes to attract certain types of pollinators, this pollination syndrome idea has been around forever. And the assumption here is that the animal has some sort of innate preference for particular odor or color cues. And although there are some specialist pollinators, so some flower visiting animals that specialize on a single plant species, and there are varying degrees of specialization, going from complete specialization to generalization. Most of these things, this is sort of there are certainly associations between pollinators and the floral traits of the plants that they pollinate, but this notion that these animals have innate predispositions is utterly false. So how is it that we determine that, right? So how is it that we, the idea hummingbirds are attracted to red flowers. They have an innate attraction for red flowers. Bumblebees are attracted to blue flowers. How is it that we determined that this isn't the case and that we need to look beyond this simplified notion of plant-pollinator interactions. And the way we do this is through this empirical or sort of evidence-based approach. The key here is that that I want you to focus on is that we're asking a particular question. You know, the hypothesis part of it, you need to be able to test your hypothesis through some sort of experimentation, but the data collection and analysis of the data, interpretation of the result, this is generally the process that I'm going to be referring to. And in the title, you know, when we say the word science, this is basically what we mean, and I generalize it to evidence-based or data-driven. And I'm going to talk about how we absolutely lack data when it comes to pollinators in an ecological context and these pollination systems. And if we don't start getting data soon, we're going to get ecosystem collapse. We're going to start to lose ecosystem services. So the way that we've done this, that you can demonstrate this in the lab, so we look at this monarch butterfly, you can show them different colors and different odors, and you can see what their response is. So in this monarch butterfly, if you touch its forelegs with sucrose solution, it sticks out its tongue. It's like Pavlov's dog, right? There's an innate response in the butterfly to sugar solution touching its forelegs. Now we show it a color, and we don't see its tongue sticking out. We don't see anything going on until we touch the forelegs and get this reflexive pattern. Once the tongue touches, or proboscis touches the sucrose solution, an association is made in that insect's brain, even though it's the size of a pinhead, that associates that color with reward. And then we can show the butterfly after training, so a few pairings of the color with reward, we can show different colors. Again, we would expect if there was an innate preference for particular colors, the butterfly's tongue would be sticking out looking for food because it's got this innate reflex, like the sucrose. We show it one color, then we show it the test color, and very rapidly we start to see that butterfly looking for food. So that's basic associative learning, and that's how most pollinators figure out what to eat. They sample and they make decisions based on the highest quality food. If you're a bee, it could be pollen or nectar. If you're a butterfly, it's nectar. It could be sugar content or amino acids. So the norm then is that most pollinators learn and remember these different cues. There aren't these innate. We can do the same thing for bumblebees. We can give them a whole bunch of different colors. We can look at naive bees and see do they have a bias in what they choose. And the answer is no. The other interesting thing about bumblebees and bumblebee pollinated plants, so shifting back to the plants, is they tend to have a complex morphology. So what we can do is we can test. See, do they know how to get inside a closed tube structure? And so here's a centrifuge tube with the cap bent over, and you can see the bee took a long time and eventually learned it had to lift up the cap and crawl inside the tube to get the reward. If we look at that same bee a few visits later,
and it knew how to get out there.
yes, so it also has to learn how to back out. So you'll notice that it lifts up and compresses its body to get in. And the second video shows that after trial and error learning, and we can plot the time it takes, we see that bee learns how to get that nectar. It compresses its body, doesn't even have to lift up. It knows how to compress its body to get into that tube to get that reward. And this is what's going on. So the bees and other pollinators have remarkably sophisticated cognitive abilities. This butterfly, for example, 3 pairings that learned that color for the memory lasted a month. I also trained the same butterfly to odors and shapes and remembered those for a month. Of course, if I start to unpair those things, they'll change their preferences, and that's basically the way that they're making these decisions. So that's how we use science in the lab to determine and test whether they have these preferences. The other is, the other way that we can test, and this is just another example. So here is your typical hummingbird pollinated flower, Mimulus cardinalis. Here's your typical bumblebee pollinated flower, so these syndromes that we were talking about. And the question is, is this attractive to hummingbirds? Is this attractive to bees? Our hypothesis was that actually this isn't attractive to hummingbirds. So when you take naive hummingbirds, it's very difficult to do so. But when they've done so, they don't have an innate preference for red. You'll see hummingbirds visiting red and anything. It's all learning. They're long-lived. Most insects are only living a year, a few weeks, but the hummingbirds are long-lived, so they have long-term memories of these associations. So what we did was we took the traits here. The other misconception out there is that bees can't see red. That's false as well. So how do we test that? Well, we create artificial flowers in the lab. So we've based on the bee pollinated flower, we have red versus purple. We also change the orientation. And so this is showing you the proportion of visits to the cardinalis, the red flower. This is color alone. 50% of the visits were to red, 50% of the visits were to purple. Orientation, so upright versus more horizontal, pretty much 50-50. When we put the two together, we noticed that the bees avoided the hummingbird pollinated flower. So there's this synergistic effect of the trait, so trait combinations that are having this deterrent effect on the pollinators, and it's also increasing the amount of repetitions, which is benefiting the plant. So they're moving from among flowers of the same type, which from the plant's perspective is an ideal scenario. So the question is, why are they doing that? And it turns out that bees will readily visit red flowers when they're by themselves. I have lots of examples of bees visiting red flowers. But when you put the blue flowers in there, what happens is that they are more efficient at detecting and processing the information of the flower when it's got this color and this orientation. And so they tend to specialize on this flower because they can get more nectar per unit time, which is benefiting the bee. What this also does is it opens up a resource for hummingbirds. And so because the bees are over here, the hummingbirds now have access to a resource and there's no competition. And that's how the plants are separating those two types of pollinators. So if we look at pollination systems, again, there's this fit between the animal and the plant. But I want you to think of both as the unit. There are certainly plants that are pollinated by hummingbirds. This example, you can see the pollen up here. It hits the forehead of the hummingbird. When it goes to the next flower or the next plant, the pollen will be transferred to the stigma of the flower on the other plant. Bumblebees, bumblebee pollinated flowers, you can see that the pollen is positioned. So certainly plants have evolved ways to get their pollen transferred effectively. So where they put their reproductive organs, here's a butterfly with pollen on its tongue, here's a fly, you can see the pollen here. But what I want to point out is that if a bumblebee visits this flower, right, it'll go crawl into the bottom of this flower. If it's long tongue, maybe it can reach it, but it's not going to make contact with the stamens, right? It's not going to pick up pollen. So in that case, the bee is a flower visitor and actually is having a negative effect on the bee. It's taking the nectar so that this hummingbird is going to say, well, there's no food here, and it's going to go somewhere else. Similarly, this hummingbird could easily visit this flower, and they do, but when they do, they don't transfer pollen. So you can have varying degrees of pollinator efficiency, right? Some animals are more efficient pollinators, some don't pollinate at all. And that's why we really need to make a distinction between a flower visitor and a pollinator. And so if we put out plants that are, something that we deem to be a pollinator of something, to keep it going, that does not mean that it is benefiting the ecologically speaking, right? If it's not visiting it's not visiting its match, if you will, if it's not visiting the flower that it has co-evolved with, then it's not contributing to the biodiversity that goes beyond the plant, if you will. A good example, or I think a pretty good example of this, is a lot of people put out hummingbird feeders. We need to support our hummingbirds. We need to give them food. Well, when you put out a hummingbird feeder, I can guarantee you that all of these plant species that depend on hummingbirds for pollination are not going to get pollinated, because what's in this container is far more, first of all, it's in one location. They don't have to do much to get it, and it's probably got a lot more in terms of sugar and other things in it than these plants. And so even though we think that we're helping are pollinators, we're actually not. We're helping the animal, we're helping the flower visitor, but we are not helping the pollination process. And without this pollination process, we do not get to the next step, which is supporting wildlife. So hopefully you can see. So if we had, even if we had one plant species that every single pollinator on the planet could visit, would that be a good thing? No, because all of the plants that they're supposed to be pollinating wouldn't get the pollination, and all of the wildlife that depends on those plants for survival, for food, for nesting sites, that would all go away. Okay, so we really need to think about the interaction, and we really need to think about the plant. So why is this so important that we protect these interactions? The reason is because the interaction between pollinators and plants is called a keystone interaction. Now, this is generalized that the pollinators are keystone species, but that means that the interaction is having a positive effect throughout the ecosystem. So our interactions here may supply food to somebody at this trophic level, and the abundance of individuals at this trophic level is feeding this trophic level. And so we have a system, this pollination network, where we have all these interactions supplying food, shelter, and nest sites for everybody on this level that's supplying food, shelter, and nest sites here. So as we start to break these associations apart, either through pollinator decline or the loss of native plant species in particular, then what we see is this cascading negative effect on the ecosystem. And what eventually is going to happen is that you will get what's called ecosystem collapse. If we remove so many pollinators from the system, so many interactions from the system, that this level doesn't have enough food, you're going to get this crash. And we're going to start to lose what are called ecosystem services. Those are services we get from nature for free. Things like carbon sequestration, decomposition, water purification. All of these things depend on a healthy ecosystem and biodiversity. And a lot of that is what I call pollinator-mediated biodiversity. But to get there, you need to know what is the pollinator of the native plant. Okay, so let's contrast that scenario, where we've got thousands of species interacting, we've got biodiversity and ecosystem services we're generating, with pollination in an agricultural context, which is what most people are familiar with. So here, we typically have one or two species, so there are only a handful of managed species, in particular the honeybee, that's visiting one non-native plant species that's servicing one species. That species is us. Now, clearly that's extremely important for us, right? But what I want you the reason that I bring this up is that strategies for conserving biodiversity and strategies for conserving pollination in an agricultural context, there's no comparison. They're extremely different, and I'm going to get into that in a second. But we're here again. And the other thing here is that most of our native pollinators don't like crop plants. Why? Because they're crappy sources of nectar and pollen. So we get a subset visiting the crop plants. And I'll say in an ecological context, the honeybee, because it's a non-native, is actually can be considered a competitor and a problem in that context, because it's competing and pulling out resources from the environment, nectar and pollen from these native plants. And that's going to disrupt the system, ecologically speaking. So if we remove the honeybee from North America, it would have no ecological impact, but clearly it would have a huge impact for food and agribusiness. And so I'm not saying that honeybees are a bad thing. I'm saying that each type of animal has its place. The honeybee has its place in agriculture, but it has no business in an ecological context. So when we look at pollinator decline, again, just to contrast the agricultural context and colony collapse disorder, which is receiving a lot of attention, a lot of funding, versus the ecological context where we've got many species in decline. Honeybees aren't going extinct, but these species are. Bombus affinis, for example, is the first bumblebee on the endangered species list. And in 5 years, unless we figure out what's going on, it will be gone. And it was, when I was going through grad school, which isn't, well, it's fairly long ago, but not that long ago, I guess. It was one of the most abundant species in my study area. It was so abundant, it's a hole-binding species, that I couldn't find flowers that didn't have a hole in them. Fast forward 5 years, and I couldn't find aphids everywhere, and I traveled hundreds of miles to try to find it. and I wasn't able to find it. So we're talking about many species here, many connections with native plants here. Here we're talking about a single species in an agricultural context. So how is it that we know that these species are in decline? Again, this brings in the empirical approach. So typically what's done, and this is what we've done for Massachusetts, so this is the status of bumblebees in Massachusetts, is if you have good historical records, you can look at the historical records, you can find out what was in a particular area, and you go back and resurvey the area, and you compare the two. And so this is how we've established that we have a global pollinator decline. It's through this. Now, we have good records for bumblebees, but we don't have good records for the vast majority of our native pollinators. And so there are probably a lot of species that are in trouble. We just don't have a way, that we don't have the records to quickly establish. We have to find other means to show that there's decline. There are other ways to do it empirically. You can compare different areas and the abundance and diversity in different areas to try to figure these things out. What I want you to notice is that while we do have species that are in decline, so Bombus avius and Pennsylvanicus, we haven't found any through our four years of intensive surveys across the state. What I want you to notice here is that there are also some species that are doing way better than they have historically, and also they've expanded their geographic ranges. So this notion that all pollinators are in decline is absolutely false as well. Some are near extinction, others are more abundant than they've ever been. So when you go in your backyard, or you're looking at your garden and you say all of these bees, well, unless you have 5 or 6, 7 species, if you're talking about bumblebees, then you're in trouble. And if I'm telling you, if you go west of 90 or east of 91, around August, it's all going to be one species when there should be 6 there. It's all going to be Bombus impatiens. And this Bombus impatiens wave, which is this one here, that's increased and expanded its geographic range and increased its abundance, relative abundance, is a symptom of whatever's causing those other species to go extinct, and we're trying to figure that out. That's one of the goals of our research. So the two phases of pollinator conservation, then we have agriculture, where we were really considered agricultural productivity. To get that, all we need are enough pollinators to do the job, right? So we're really focused on pollinator abundance. It does not matter how many species you have, it just matters that you have enough of a particular pollinator that's going to get the job done. In an ecological context, pollinator equals biodiversity and ecosystem service. So it's absolutely, diversity is key here, as well as abundance, of these native plant-pollinator interactions, because that's what's churning out the biodiversity and providing these ecosystem services. So different contexts, different priorities, different goals, therefore we should have different strategies. Unfortunately, we're not at that point where we have made this distinction. Because of the importance of pollinators in agricultural context, things tend to be biased in that direction, and biased in particular in the direction of the honeybee. What I want to point out in the conservation, when we're talking about ecological conservation, is that we, in managed bees, we take care of the bees, right? We give them a place to live, give them stuff to eat, we treat them for disease. All of that, the wild pollinators have to do on their own. So when we think about conservation strategies for wild pollinators, we have to think about the entire life cycle. If it's a bee, right now the bumblebee queens are overwintering, they'll come out in the spring and they have to find a nest site, then they have to find enough nectar and pollen in particular to lay the first brood, then the workers come out in the summer, and then they put out reproductives in the fall. That's the annual cycle. In monarch butterflies, we've got the larval stage, and then we've got the adult stage. So they need different types of plants for those different stages. So we need to think a lot more about, we need to think about the entire life cycle when we're focused on the ecological side of things. And so this ecological approach then is we need to identify, if we're talking about conservation and restoring, we need to identify the unique ecological needs, interactions, and stressor responses of the declining pollinator species. So I can, the reason that we have so much diversity is because they respond to things differently, right? They've evolved their niche, they have their interactions, and so we need to figure out what those are for our declining pollinator species like Bombus avius. What interactions, how are those interactions, what are the cascading effects of those interactions throughout the ecosystem and at every life stage? right? So if a monarch butterfly doesn't find a milkweed plant, female monarch butterfly, then the population's done, right? Similarly, if a bumblebee queen doesn't find a nest site, that population is going to be affected. So we have to think more comprehensively in this notion that one size fits all. In fact, it's the complete opposite, that every species is unique, and we have to find out what those unique set of needs actually are. So, okay, so bumblebee species historically present in Massachusetts are 11. 2 we think are no longer present, although I still remain optimistic. I have to check a couple of areas where they're historically present. Certainly there are some that are in trouble, but I want to go over some of the pilot studies with bumblebees just to show you how when we collect certain types of data, when we ask certain questions and collect certain data, it really helps it really has an impact in terms of getting these connections together and increasing diversity and helping threatened species. So the life cycle I mentioned, it's an annual life cycle, and what I want to do, yes, sorry, I skipped the slide somehow. So for bumblebees or for any pollinators, what do we think are driving these declines that we're seeing? Pesticides, climate change, non-native species, that's both plant and pollinator, infectious agents, and habitat change are the major things. In terms of the pollinator decline in ecological context, habitat change is probably the biggest thing. Certainly if we're in urban and agricultural areas, pesticides and infectious agents start to come into play. Climate change. So we're looking at all of these in the lab and picking up on this idea that species are different. We want to look at how do species respond differently to these stressors. So the first one is neonicotinoids. So I'm sure that you're familiar with the effects of neonicotinoids and their negative effects on pollinators. What I want to point out is that the EPA only tests honeybees at this point. They may include another species, but it's only going to be workers of probably Bombus impatiens, which isn't a threatened species at all. What we were concerned with is how because these pesticides, they're insect neurotoxins, they persist in the soil for long periods of time and they get into wildflowers, how are they affecting different life stages in the bumblebee? How are they affecting the queens, the males, and the workers? We need all of those things to be healthy to keep our populations going. And so what we did was we used ecologically or field realistic doses, and we fed them small doses daily to look at chronic oral exposure. And what we can see is that for queens, after 7 days, we started to see reduced survival. In the workers, after 5 days at 10 parts per billion, we started to see a reduction. But interesting, when we look at males, at 7 parts per billion, we started to see 50% of the population gone after 6 days. Controlling for body size, queens and males are far more sensitive to neonicotinoid exposure than workers. And they're using workers as the test, right? They're using, so it doesn't have an effect on workers. Well, of course it's not going to have an effect on anything else, right? Well, that's wrong. And so this demonstrates how paying attention to diversity and life cycle is going to help us to regulate these pesticides. The other thing is, let's look at a declining species. So we used Bombus impatiens because we were interested in looking at differences between males, workers, and queens. But we also looked at a species that's declining in many areas. In Western Mass, actually, this is the Bombus vagans is doing quite well. And what we see is at 10 and 7 parts per billion, after 2 days and 3 days, half the worker population is gone. So, again, this one size fits all, that the honeybee is going to be able to tell us how every pollinator species, the hundreds and thousands of pollinator species, and this is just bees, let alone butterflies. So the monarch butterfly, the concentration of neonics is far higher in leaf tissue than it is in floral nectar and pollen. So what about all the butterflies that are eating the neonics in the leaves? So this is where we need to expand the testing to try to figure out how it's affecting diversity. The second thing that's thought to be driving decline is habitat change. So to figure out what's going on here, we want to do surveys of these plant-pollinator interactions and try to figure out, are there particular plant species that the threatened species like? Because if we can figure out that they like pollen and nectar from certain plant species, then that's how we can implement, take those data to help to improve our conservation strategies. It's assumed that bumblebees are generalists, right? And this gets into this generalist specialist thing. They're generalists in terms of they aren't restricted to one thing, and if you lose that thing, they die. But they certainly like things, they have preferences, right? It's very similar to fast food. You'll eat fast food rather than starve to death. But if you had a choice between fast food and something that is probably on the healthier side, you would choose that if that option were available. So seeing bees on plants doesn't necessarily mean that that is what they prefer. And so how did we establish that? We went out and we did weekly transects from June to October, and we surveying not just the bees but the plants that they were on and what type of behavior. Were they collecting nectar? Were they collecting pollen? Was it a queen? Was it a worker? Was it a male? And when we look at periods where all of the species shown here, all these bumblebee species are together, so they're all foraging in the same environment. There were 25 plant species where we saw a bumblebee, but if we look at the resource use, you can see that in every case, the species are primarily focused on a single one or two plant species. And so a lot of this can be explained based on tongue length, right? Long tongue bees fit with tubular flowers because they have a competitive advantage. But even within that, we can see that bush honeysuckle and milkweed, we see some of these longer tongue bees liking these the milkweed and bush honeysuckle. Especially here, the medium tongue bees, Bombus chrysiocolis is pretty much a milkweed specialist. When milkweed's in bloom, if you see anything on milkweed, there's a 95% chance it's going to be Bombus chrysiocolis. And this is any type of milkweed, right? Common milkweed, swamp milkweed, it doesn't matter. Bombus chrysiocolis loves it. So Bombus perplexus to some degree likes it as well, but Bombus perplexus loves bush honeysuckle. Notice that Bombus impatiens is foraging on vetch and spreading dogbane. Completely different. So the question is why? They have the same tongue length, they're the same body size, and what we think is going on is that there's something in the nectar chemistry. There are certain compounds in the nectar that are not just attracting some, so these gustatory preferences, but they're actually repelling pollinators or animals that aren't effective pollinators. So Bombus impatiens is a super generalist, and we've done some preliminary lab work, and we've taken the compounds we see in these different plant species, and sure enough, compared to straight sugar water, there are some that they absolutely love, even at really high, ridiculously high concentrations, and there are certain that they will avoid. They don't like the taste of them for whatever reason. We're trying to figure out what the mechanism is. And so this adds another layer to things. The other important thing here is that that's nectar plants. In pollen plants, again, 25 plant species in bloom, we only saw the bees collecting pollen on 2 plant species, St. John's wort and meadowsweet. So you can tell the behavioral difference between nectar collecting and pollen collecting. And so what this tells us is that when we plant, we have to start thinking about nectar and pollen plants. We need to supply both. We have to start thinking about tongue length and the preferences of different bumblebee species. So when we look at, you can't think of bumblebees as this single entity and they all share similar preferences, and even if they have the same tongue length. The other thing we noticed is that Carolina and Virginia rose is highly favored by all of these species. So on the rose, we've seen Bombus fervidus, we've seen Bombus borealis, which isn't shown here, at various sites across the state. So if we look at the current conservation solution, right, so in terms of plant choice, notice here under bumblebee, so first of all, it's not broken down by species, but under clover, there's no X. Right, Bombus fervidus is rapidly declining and it's going to be gone in 5 years. It's declining that quickly. It loves red clover almost exclusively. Bombus vagans is declining. It loves red clover. Right, so clearly this is incorrect. The other thing is down here, rose. Yes, bumblebees will visit it, but does it separate it out as a major source of pollen versus nectar? No. So we need that level of detail if we're going to develop effective land management strategies. We have to think about the entire life cycle. We have to think about specific species level needs and the differences, like the differences between nectar and pollen. And so here's what we currently The current solution, again, 5 minutes, sorry. I went on the web and just pulled these. I'm not picking on these companies if you're in the audience or groups or whatever. I just want to point out that I talked to you about the fit and species level and how, tongue length. And look at this, it's all one type of, it's basically all composites, right? Long-tongued bumblebees aren't going to visit composites or anything with a shallow unless they're doing it for pollen, because their long tongue gets in the way. They don't have a competitive advantage. Their competitive advantage is on tubular flowers, where they can get to the nectar at the bottom of that spur, where a short-tongued bee, unless it's a hole biter, isn't going to be able to do it. So we have to start thinking, again, more comprehensively about what we are putting out, and we have to think about it in terms of connections. So what I propose, and this is based on our research, the rows I mentioned, we have all bumblebee species getting pollen. This is going to help the bumblebees because without pollen they can't produce new bees. They can survive forever without pollen, but they can't make new bees. Nectar they need as energy, they'll only survive for 24 hours. But look, on the rows is host for the apple sphinx moth. And the products of the pollination, the rose hips, supply food to all of these birds. The sphinx moth would supply food to the eastern whippoorwill, which is currently in trouble. The larva is supplying food to this group of birds. So when we think about plants, we want to think about where can we get the most bang for our buck. And when I say that, I'm talking about biodiversity. So just planting Virginia and Carolina rose, they have enough pollen, they'll supply enough pollen for the pollen collecting bees through the year, and they will also supply food for all of these other animals, and we can, and this is just me looking at one plant species. Eventually, I'm going to be linking together the bees, the butterflies, the birds, and create these ecological networks, and that's how we're going to start to develop these strategies. So the non-native exotic thing, I just want to point out that not only do they prefer specific plant species, but clearly bumblebees either love or hate exotics. And so when I go into a habitat and I see what's in bloom, I can tell you right away what bumblebee species are going to be there and which species are not going to be there. And if we have a lot of exotics, we are eliminating these three species right out of the gate because they don't tend to visit. So this, again, all of these species and plant species were all occurring at the same time, equally accessible to everybody, yet they partition themselves out this way. So the exotics, not only do they, so what they do is so it's a new resource that's coming in, and so it's going to affect the competitive interactions between the pollinators, but also it's going to affect the plants. So this is Breakneck Hill, the native plants. This entire 44 acres was covered with native plants. So goldenrod, blue vervain, Joe Pye weed, meadowsweet, and spreading dogbane. There's purple loosestrife in this small area down here. If we look at the visitation to purple loosestrife, it was off the charts. So all of this red is all purple loosestrife visiting and very few natives. So what we did is we went in, we cleared the purple loosestrife in 2017, and immediately we saw a shift to the exotics, a shift to the natives. And in particular, look at the increases in visitation to these native species. So even removing a small patch of an exotic will have a major impact on the native plant pollinator interactions and those native pollination systems that I was talking about. The last thing that I want to point out, talk about climate change. I probably have 1 second left. 1 minute. Is this complicated? Because I started at 9:06. I'm trying to roll through this.
No, you got the
I did? Okay, darn. I thought I'd planned better. Anyway, so what we can do is we can look at historical records and look at how what's called phenology, so the way that the bee populations fluctuate over the year. So there are certain species that peak early, and there are certain species that peak late. If we look at our current data, the early species, there hasn't really been much of a shift. But if we look at our late species, a lot of them have shifted back. Their phenologies have shifted back a couple of months. And there could be a number of explanations for this, and we're trying to figure it out. But clearly something is going on late summer that's pushing, that's acting as a selective force, and certain species are able to shift their phenologies and others aren't. So Bombus affinis, that's on the endangered species list, was peaking late summer as well. And it is probably not doing well because it doesn't have the variation, the genetic variation, to shift its phenology. So we're currently looking at plant and animal pollinator phenologies to try to figure out what's going on here. All right, so to wrap things up, what we need to do is we need to change public perception, right? We need to think, instead of thinking about pollinators and animals and let's just keep those pollinators healthy, we have to think about the interaction. What are the animal pollinated, what animals are pollinating our native plant species, and we need to build those connections. To do that, we need to conduct research because we don't know, there are major knowledge gaps in terms of understanding these pollination networks. We have to get researchers from different areas. So I'm on the pollinator side. We need a butterfly person. We need a bird person. And the common point is the plant, right? We need a plant person because that's the hub for all of this diversity. And then we need to develop, use the data that we collect to develop more effective strategies. So it's a work in progress, but I will say through the Beecology Project, that I won't get to today probably, we've really, through the help of citizen scientists, many of which are sitting here, I'm very grateful to everybody that's helped out with this project, but we've found a species that was thought to be gone from the state through citizen science, through this project. We have phone apps and things. But just to finish things off, what we need to do is how are we going to use and collect data to develop these conservation strategies. So first of all, this is based on our work, Carolina and Virginia rose. This is its bloom time. So if you have willow, which is extremely important, plus these two, you've got pollen available right through August. Okay. Wild yellow indigo is a favorite of Bombus vagans. It's got a long bloom time. There is a nectar source for Bombus vagans. So between this and this, you've got Bombus vagans, which is a species in trouble. So you could use the information that we have, but also when you're out there, you just need to observe the interactions, right? You can build your own data set, and you can start to look at these preferences and these patterns and start to put things together and you know, sort of incorporate this more evidence-based or data-driven or data-based approach into your land conservation. So I have handouts with a plant list that we've developed based on our research, as well as a habitat management plan. So if you score well on that, it's a bumblebee focused, but take a look at that, and if you answer yes to 9 out of the 10 questions, we still don't know enough about nest sites to be able to, so I'll let that one pass for now until I figure out more about nesting preferences. But that should give you some sort of guide. I'm certainly happy to answer any questions. We have I'll finish off here with our website, beecology.wpi.edu. There's a lot of information here about species guides, there are tutorial videos, how to use the apps to help to get data into our database, how to use the visualization tools that we have. And with that, I will take any questions.